Hello everyone, this is update for June 12, 2024, day 840 of the war, end of the date update. Also catch up for June 11, 10, and 9. I'm going to start as I always do with macroeconomic or just general economic overview, call it strategic overview because it all matters. And I'm going to switch to the strategic developments that are more relevant directly to the war, and then I'm going to do a quick overview of the situation on the battlefield. So first is developments, economic developments in the West, mostly because Russian statistical information is fairly unreliable, but I'll try to present that as well when there is opportunity. But right now we're gonna start with the UK, and there's a little bit of data that came out from the UK, which looks pretty, I would say, pretty bad. And the overall picture is that it's not even bad, but the trend is in a negative direction. So it's probably going to get worse before it's going to get better. But let's start with first metric, which is unemployment. So unemployment is rising in the UK. Then we can see that construction also declining. GDP barely grew, and the trend is negative in April. Then industrial production is down, as you can see, and it's from positive number to negative 0.4%. And then manufacturing production also have a negative trend from 0.7 to 0.6. And I want to make clarification that manufacturing production is a subset of industrial production. So industrial would include also utilities, energy production, and mining, and so on. So the fact that industrial is down, what this really means is that mining and electricity production is apparently down significantly in the UK, because manufacturing, as we can see, was still positive. So, but overall trend, as you can see, generally pretty negative. This jives with this snap elections that are happening in the UK, because all of this negative economic situation translates in the political arena, obviously, because politics is basically expression of the economic situation, and so that is really what's going on in the UK. And as I mentioned many times before, this is a result of war on energy, and then sanctions that don't really work. They actually hurt West more than anything. Now let's switch to the next country, is China. There's not terribly much, but there is a CPI that came from China for May. And as you can see, the growth there is 0.3%. Really means that inflation is down in China. Even may go into actually deflationary situation. This is reflective of general weakness in the Chinese economy, and really means that things are really not going well inside of Chinese economy, which I think for those who sort of follow what I was sharing, is they sort of aware that things are not going well in China, generally speaking. They're not disastrous, but I don't want to like sort of make a gloom and doom end of the world. That's not the case, but it's clearly not the rosy picture, not what it used to be. Let's say 10 years, 8 years ago, when it was gross, and the trees were growing to the sky. That's not the case anymore in China, and China is struggling at this point mightily. Then let's switch to the situation in the US, because that's another important center of power. The US had some information in terms of CPI or inflation consumer inflation in the U.S. And as you can see, inflation is slowly but surely going down. So there are two numbers: core CPI, which is excluding volatile items such as food, like let's say energy, which means diesel and gasoline, but in US it's really gasoline. And then general CPI that includes everything, including volatile. And as you can see, trend is towards inflation going down in the US. This makes it possible down the road for potentially decrease in interest rate by the U.S. central bank, which is called U.S. Federal Reserve, which was announced actually on the 12th. U.S. Federal Reserve held the rates steady, did not decrease the rates, similar to how it was done in the EU and how it was done actually in Canada. So even, but I want to highlight that those moves in the EU and in Canada, they are more sort of desperation moves, where the central banks had to do that because the consequences of high interest rates are much more sort of negative relative to actually potential spike in inflation, which likely to happen, and we'll see what happens in the coming months. But this is the situation in the US, and then I promised to look into fiscal situation or US government budget and debt and overall just a sort of economic health in the US. And so first, I want to highlight here, I put here government debt. I mentioned in previous videos that was sort of stable in since like early March through mid-May, end of May, and that's because of the payment of personal taxes that are centered around end of March, first half of April in the US. So there's sort of like the revenue, government revenue is skewed towards this period. So you're getting extra, but then you're getting a lot less throughout the rest of the year. And so that was the main explanation why the debt was sort of stable. And that season sort of over, and we can even look at the reports by the U.S. Treasury Department that shows that in April there was surplus, right? So the revenues exceeded the expenses. So it was positive situation, but it's illusion. This positive situation that was just result of payment of the taxes for the most of the year, essentially. And so it's not, in other words, it's not normal situation. And so in May, as you can see, things kind of returned back to normal, which shows deficit. So which really means that expenses exceed revenues, which is obviously bad and negative and so on. So specifically in May, the expenses exceeded revenue by 347 billions, which is very big number for 1 month. If this would be run rate for the entire year, this really means more than 4 trillion in debt, which is really huge number. As you can see, U.S. economy is 27 point, let's say 4 trillion, right? So, and this is just the government expand, like basically unfunded spending of the government, 4 trillion, which is it's just simply unsustainable, huge amount. And this May looks probably more of an outlier in terms of how negative it is. So but the situation is obviously unsustainable in US. And I actually would like to kind of look and show you a little bit the key problem areas and where it, how things may play out in the coming years there. And I'm actually going to look at the cumulative number. So this is showing the same what I showed before, except this is since the beginning of the fiscal year, which was October 1st. So this is October 1st, 2023 through May 31st, 2024. So this is uh, almost 8 months of out of the 12 months of the fiscal year. So this is pretty representative of where U.S. State budget will end, will finish. Basically, it's representative of where the finish line is going to be for the U.S. Budget. And so far for this 8 months, it was 1.2 trillion of deficit. So it looks very likely that U.S. will hit 2 trillion in deficit, not the 4 trillion that I mentioned before. So this is sort of base case scenario that's going to be 2 trillion, a little bit less. I think last year was like 1.8 trillion, meaning last fiscal year. So things are, definitely not in control, and the spending, is out of control in the U.S. And first, I want to explain what's the source of revenues for the U.S. government, and the peculiar, I don't know if it's peculiar, but specific feature of the U.S. Governmental revenues, that they all coming from individual taxpayers, essentially. There is not much coming from any other sources. So as you can see, individual income taxes, right? So this is taxes people pay, and then social insurance and retirement. This is what they pay into the pension system, which is called Social Security here. In the US, it's just the name is Social Security, but really it's a pension system in the US. And then, as you can see, corporations they pay very little taxes in the US, and in some ways it makes a lot of sense because effectively all of this. Business entities or legal entities, they are passed through. So most of the taxes are basically, most of the income is passed to the individual, and then the individual pays taxes based on the tax schedule that works. In some ways, it's probably actually a clean system that prevents where it's really the individual that's sort of building block of the society in some ways, right? So that's who should be paying. Then also, as you can see, all of the custom duties and all of the rest of the stuff is very low, and U.S. is obviously has very low import tariffs on imported goods. It relies. That's why there is pretty much very little of manufacturing, and this is not the only reason. Actually, the real reason is actually much more profound, and this is just in some way it's actually consequence of that bigger problem, so that you have to have lower import tariffs to keep standard of life at reasonable level. So in some ways, this is a symptom. The low import tariffs, which is here custom duties, this is not the reason. It's actually a symptom of other problem. But so hopefully this kind of makes sense in terms of how revenue is working in the U.S. For the U.S. government. And then if you look at the expenses, this is where the most sort of interesting stuff is happening. So first is there's pension expenses called Social Security. They big, obviously, and it is what it is. And then there is also income security. So there you can kind of like lump these two items into one. and they effectively funded by this social insurance and retirement. So this is what people pay, and this is what government then pays to people out of this bucket essentially. And as you can see, this bucket is unbalanced. So the payments are to individuals, pension payments and unemployment payments, by income security is essential unemployment payments. They exceed what is being collected, but not by huge. It's sort of relatively balanced situation if you consider this. Where really things are getting out of control in the U.S. is really in the healthcare area. In this, Medicare is basically healthcare for, think, old, and then general healthcare for general population. So this is actually 1.2 trillion. So if you're really saying this whole deficit is essentially driven by this healthcare costs that are really in the U.S. are completely out of control. And I'll come back to that, but I just want to highlight these key areas because essentially you rely on individual income taxes and, let's say, corporate taxes to pay for the rest of it. Because, as I said, that social insurance and retirement is essentially going to pay for this social security pension and income security, which is unemployment benefits, I think. So the rest is really these items here are essentially not, they're not contributing much. So really this is only individual income taxes and corporate taxes, which is together 2 trillion. And you basically need to pay for the rest of it with that. And out of that, 1.2 trillion is really healthcare expenses. As I stated, they are actually one of the highest on per capita basis than the rest of the developed world, and actually the quality of healthcare is one of the lowest in the developed world. So as you can see, there is a huge inefficiency in probably inefficiency is not the right even word, but the quality actually of healthcare, which might be counterintuitive for most people, is actually low. That's what really this number is actually telling you. The other item is net interest. As you can see, it's 600 billion, and then also defense expenses, which is also roughly 600 billion. So let's say I wouldn't question the defense expense because everybody understands what kind of world we're living in and all of that. The problem with net interest is that it's really big. It's ballooning, and if we look actually go back, so on a monthly basis, and it's obviously not perfect sort of proxy, but as you can see, it's actually 87 billion in May, and then 85 billion in April. So if we do actually run rate, this is close to 1 trillion for the entire year. This number doesn't look as bad right now because at the beginning of the year, so let's say October, November, December of 23, interest rates were not as high. The U.S. government was not paying as high interest rates on its debt when they issued that. But now it's actually going up very quickly. And I want to explain why it's going up very quickly, because what happens is that U.S. Treasury is basically making a bet that interest rates are going to go down, let's say in a year or 2 years. And so what they do, they essentially issuing a debt that's fairly short term, 3-6 months up to a year. So most of the debt that they issue, new debt, is as I said, fairly short term. And what this chart shows, that the short term debt carries higher interest rates. So you see it's roughly slightly above 5.4%, right? So this is where it is. Because if, let's say, US Treasury would issue, let's say, 7-year debt or even 10-year debt, as you can see, would the interest rate would be almost like 1% lower relative to what they paying right now. And so this is obviously sought out decision, and the only way you can explain is that U.S. Treasury is hoping, planning that interest rates, well, short-term, generally, interest rates are going to go down, and so they don't want to lock themselves in a long-term, like 5, 7, 10 years at 4.4%, because then you're going to be paying over a long period of time what they believe is high interest rates. So, in other words, they believe generally that interest rates will decline across the board. The short-term interest rates, which I mentioned, about 5%, and then long-term rates, which is 10 years, and medium-term 5 to 7 years, that they gonna go down. So they don't want to lock government into paying what they believe is going to be high interest rates. Uh, this like sort of bet we'll see if this is going to play out, because it actually may not play out. And then if it doesn't, because and that's driven obviously by the inflation. So inflation is going to be one of the important and key situation in the US, because if inflation persists and Federal Reserve in the US cannot reduce interest rates, then this high interest rates will persist, or I wouldn't even call them high, but what the U.S. Treasury believe that is high, they will persist. And then what's going to happen? U.S. effectively will have this short-term debt that really at the high interest rate, right? Relative to 4.4%. So what they would effectively have done is that they replaced all of their debt with the highest interest rate debt that's possible. So in other words, this strategy betting that the rates are going to go down can backfire phenomenally, because you may end up with the really highest interest rate you can have, which would be like this, 5.4%, 5.5, basically in that area. And so your interest, and then what this really means, that your net interest is going to skyrocket pretty quickly. So I mentioned that US has 34.7 trillion in the government debt, and if you replace that with 5% interest rate, like not even 5.4, 5.5, but we'll just go to to 5%. So on 34 trillion a day, 5% is, I think it's going to be like 3.4 trillion in net interest per year, if I'm doing correct calculations, or actually, sorry, 1.7. So sorry, I was wrong. So 1.7 trillion per year, right? So what this really means is that this net interest is gonna create some kind of crisis. And it could be a trigger for the fiscal crisis in the US. Not immediate. This is probably going to happen after, obviously, within a year. It's more than a year time horizon for this. So basically, during the tenure of the next president in the US, that president will have to deal with probably fiscal crisis that's gonna probably hit U.S. government finances, and this high interest rates will probably gonna be a trigger for then cascading effect of the problems and sort of crisis in healthcare, because as you can see, healthcare is really the huge chunk of expenses. So the only way for US to somewhat balance this whole situation is really significantly reduce healthcare expenses, and like not just by little, but let's say 80%. And that's going to create significant problems, um, obviously in the US, where there will be severe rationing of healthcare, and also there will be that will become a source of significant unemployment in the US. And I'm not saying this is happening this year. This is probably, saying over 2-3 years out. But this is where it's all heading. And as I stated, this situation completely unsustainable in the U.S. and this rise in net interest in the interest expense on the government debt is probably will be a trigger for this crisis that then will start chain event of related crises, and most specifically in the healthcare area, where there will be the cuts will be probably the most severe ones out of all other government expenses. Now, I want to mention a little bit switch to the EU, and going back to this reduction in interest rates in the EU. And I mentioned that that's really a desperation move because basically European Central Bank is sort of between rock and a hard place, because if interest rates will persist at higher level, they will basically destroy this so-called alternative energy industry, because high interest rates are simply making all of this wind, solar, uneconomical. Essentially, they actually show that this whole idea of energy transition is not sustainable and not realistic, and not possible unless you want to die. And so they have to reduce that, even though inflation is actually not going down. As example, German CPI, it came actually higher. So the prior reading was 2.2, now it's 2.4. So as you can see, technically, the European Central Bank should not have decreased interest rates, because the one of the mandates that they have is to keep inflation under 2%, or roughly around 2%. And as you can see, it's actually going in opposite direction. And so that's if you purely base it on the data, your decisions, it's clearly that should not have been done. And Germany, obviously, the largest economy in EU, so it's fairly representative of the situation there. Now I'm just gonna switch a little bit closer to the situation in Ukraine, not exactly to Ukraine, but more towards military confrontation that's happening. So, and specifically between Russia and the US. So, I mentioned in the prior video that there is significant increase in confrontation, I would say confrontational ping pong, that's happening between the West and Russia mostly, but the alliance, as we all know, includes Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. So, but obviously, the Russia is on the front line, the same as Ukraine, and on the front line of this global conflict. And what happened is that Russia, I mentioned, sent its military ships and actually nuclear submarine to Cuba to show basically to the U.S. to basically make a threat to the U.S. And also, actually, those ships, Russian ships and submarine, they were as close as I think 50 kilometers from Miami in the U.S. On their way to to Cuba. In response, U.S. sent the B-52 bombers, which are it's a strategic bomber. That's the goal. The purpose of the airplane is to uh, uh, conduct nuclear strikes using obviously nuclear bombs against the enemy. So they were flying over Baltic Sea, uh, prepared, training how, doing exercises in launching nuclear bombs or missiles effectively against Russia. And Russian ships also were exercising attacks, electronic, doing electronic exercises um, in attacking the US. So as you can see, this is sort of a mutual situation. Uh, then US also in retaliation ramp up the sanction situation, and actually the sanctions US sanctioned Russian Moscow exchange and national clearing system. And clearing system is really the core of the entire financial system. It's the most I would say important part. It's like a backbone. It's sort of hidden typically. Nobody really knows. Every country has that clearing system or couple clearing systems, depending on how it's all arranged. But they are really backbones through which everything goes, everything gets settled. All of the financial transactions are going through that system. And so U.S. sanctioned Russian basically this clearing system and Moscow exchange. What this really means is that it it blows significant blow in the Russian economic and financial system, because now Moscow exchange cannot settle trades for the effects. Basically, foreign it doesn't cannot act anymore as forex exchange with respect to U.S. dollars and euros. And obviously, Russia needs U.S. dollars and euros. They are still part of the Russian economy. They actually really the lifeblood of the Russian economy. And so, what this really means, because the banks, because the participant, the buyers and sellers in this market are Russian banks and the Russian companies, and sometimes individuals, but for the most part, those are main players. And so, if you effectively destroy electronic exchange mechanism, which is the most efficient way to exchange U.S. dollars and euros between Russian economic agents, and that really what this really means, that there will be there's still going to be exchanges, but they're going to be done sort of through direct communications between the banks. So what this in the end, what this really means, that transparency from the market is destroyed, so there's no transparency, there's no informational signals to economic agents, or they become much more vague. There's much more opportunity for manipulation. So that's really additional expense on the entire economy and on every single economic agent. Every company will pay extra to exchange their Russian rubles for U.S. dollars or euros or vice versa. But basically, all of those transactions will become more expensive for every Russian company and obviously society as a whole, because in the end, these costs are going to be borne by the Russian society, which obviously includes every individual. So this is huge, and this decision is gonna have very negative effect, especially in the long run. It may not be even so bad immediately, but the long run consequences are going to be very, very, I would say, devastating for Russian economy in the long run. Unless there are some actions that's going to be done by the Russian government, which I'm sure that they will try to do something. Don't know what those gonna be, In some ways, this is actually gonna may push Russian government to switch to the gold standard, because effectively then you have gold exchange which is not destroyed, and it's a sort of solution. Uh, so basically, you bring in back that transparency, and all of the transactions are settled through gold. And so that really, this is really allows Russian government to not to bore the Russian society, um, uh, not to carry not to experience those expenses as a result of destruction. Effectively, it's a destruction of Moscow exchange, and on the plus side, it's a super stable system that potentially actually can lead to increase in prosperity. The problem is that this system is completely incompatible with the war economy, with the war machine, because war economy is relying on issuing unfunded uh, government debt, and that's not going to be possible with the gold system. So that's why I think that scenario is unlikely for the Russian government, because it's actually um, in a simple way, if the gold system effectively takes away ability of the government to cheat and steal effectively money from the society, from taxpayers, because issuing unfunded debt is effectively stealing and double taxation. And in a time of the war, double taxation is what this government want to do, and I would say triple taxation, quadruple taxation. If they could, they would be happy to take everything they can. And so this goes against that. However, I think this whole conflict is going to be won by someone, whoever is going to actually switch first to the gold standard. And in some ways, this whole conflict, this I'm not talking about war in Ukraine, I'm talking the whole conflict between West and this alliance, I don't know how you call this alliance of Russia, China, and so on, is potentially can be explained as the global migration to the gold standard. Sort of, this is kind of like a painful birth of the gold standard, potentially. Remains to be seen if that's going to be the case, but this is just a theory idea of where it's all heading and what's really underlying force for this whole conflict. Um, Now I'm gonna switch actually to the situation in Ukraine, and I'm gonna actually talk about first about this Russian, I would say, incursion into Ukrainian territory in the Sumy region. So it happened on the 9th, where I show in this area, sort of on this, if you draw a straight line towards Konotop, so this is where this happened. In some ways, this is the most short and direct way to get to Kiev from east, from Russia. However, what this turns out to be is really just a show, and this is I'm going to explain what happened. This is sort of close look at this specific area. So Russian troops uh, uh, invaded, captured this village Rizhivka, stayed there for a little bit, making pictures, and left back to Tetkina, which is Russian village. So this basically was more of a show, and this goes back to what I said before, that this invasion northeast of Kharkiv is also more of a show than a political show. For the with it basically it has political goals rather than purely military goals. So sort of winning, gaining territory, or anything, because because Russian side did not have enough troops to really have any meaningful military success northeast of Kharkiv. What it did, it created significant internal political crisis for Ukrainian president. It basically exposed Ukrainian president and his whole group as completely incompetent and corrupt, because it exposed a lack of the defenses on the border with Russia, which were, propaganda machine was saying, we're building the best ever defenses, your Machino line, your Mannerheim line, your Stalin line in one package. And it turned out that that was not true, and the money simply were stolen. And so this, as I stated, this whole incursion really, the win for Russian side was in this exposing this corruption of political top Ukrainian political top to the society. And apparently this attack in Sumy region was sort of intended to kind of continue and potentially make this crisis sort of bigger, louder, and so on. The problem for Russian side that they don't have enough resources to carry it out. That's why they barely sort of scrambled something for this attack in Kharkiv region, basically northeast of Kharkiv, and they didn't even have anything meaningful to attack in Sumy region. At least this is what it looks like so far. Then let's actually look at the situation northeast of Kharkiv. So as you can see, Russian troops completely stuck. This is from May 18. It's June 12, and the attack actually started around May 10. So this is just literally roughly a month. And since for the past months, there's no effective change in terms of Russia's advance. They stalled, and in some instances, they being even pushed back. Like most notable example is Vovchansk, where I mentioned before that Russian troops captured this northern part or core of the actually town north of the river, and now they're actually being pushed back, and essentially Ukrainian troops control this area that I showed initially. So very clearly that Russian side does not have enough resources to really make significant advances military-wise in this area, because the whole story, and let me just go back, the story is, we need to push Ukrainian troops, create sort of like a buffer zone, but as you can see, it's clear for Belgorod, right? But as you can see, it's clearly not creating any kind of buffer zone by any means, because this attack is extremely limited in a very narrow area, and you can still reach from other sort of pieces of Ukrainian territory, Belgorod. So it doesn't. That whole story doesn't add up, basically. Now let's move to the situation on the North Luhansk front line. Things here are slowly sort of deteriorating for Ukrainian side. Little by little, Russian troops are gaining ground. So in this case, Russian troops managed to completely eliminate Ukrainian bridgehead on the eastern side of this small river, and now Ukrainian troops essentially withdrew on the to the western bank of this river. So this is was completely lost, and before that, I mentioned that Russian troops made advances here towards Kupyansk. So things slowly but surely sort of morphing in sort of more territorial losses for Ukrainian side. Now let's look at the North Donbas section of the front line. Things here on the northern sector pretty much stuck. There's no No significant movements, and obviously in this case would be advances by Russian troops, but there is nothing major happening here. There is obviously, as I mentioned before, pressure, especially against Bilohorivka. There is some pressure in Rozdolivka area and also Vimka, but without really meaningful advances by Russian troops here. Now let's look at the situation west of Bakhmut, where Russian forces are attempting to capture Chasiv Yar, and this sort of attack is really, I would say, is not really working for the Russian forces. They suffer significant losses, and Ukrainian troops, have significant losses as well. But simply, it's terrain-wise, it's still difficult because of the channel, and the other thing is that Russian advantage is not that strong relative to Ukrainian troops, and I would say there are fairly good units here in this area, specifically 5th Brigade, 93rd one, that allows to sort of control the area and sort of hold on to the ground. But obviously, over a long period of time, Russian troops will advance and capture Chasiv Yar. It's just going to be very, very slow motion, sort of train wreck for Ukraine. And this is I showed this before. This is rough picture. Ukrainian forces report that they managed to liberate Kalinivka, so basically pushing back Russian troops and making even sort of situation for them worse. So basically the potential capture of Chasiv Yar is being pushed back significantly in time for Russian troops. Now let's look at the situation on the central Donbas front line, where things are really the worst for Ukrainian side and where things are moving in a negative direction. And I mentioned this is map from May 18, as you can see. There wasn't terribly much of advances since then. However, I want to provide sort of more update as Russian troops starting to sort of advance slowly but surely. And as you can see, what is happening is the pressure is in this area along this railroad that I mentioned before, because you see there's kind of like a gate effectively between the rivers that is sort of easy pass for the Russian troops, that you don't need to cross the rivers and so on, that sort of easiest pass. And so the most pressure is happening in this area between Novoaleksandrivka and then this village Sokil. Russian troops are close to be done capturing Novoaleksandrivka. They're moving along the railroad line, and then they close to be captured to finish capturing village Sokil, which really means that then they're gonna attack Ivanivka, and then they're effectively reaching this Volcheper, Lozovatske, which is sort of last line of defense in this gate. And if that's breached, then effectively it's not going to be easy to hold on Russian troops down the road there. And also what that really means, that's the reason, there's another reason why there's not huge pressure in this area, like north of Netailova all the way to Novoselivka Persha, because there's no need. If Russian troops manage to basically get through these gates, then they effectively make Ukrainian troops here on this eastern bank of this tiny river in sort of tactical encirclement, so they need to withdraw. And I show here this bridge that sort of connects that, and so they effectively, there's no need to put pressure, except Russian troops do put pressure in this area of Novoselivka Persha. They started assault on this village, and That's the only exception here. Probably attempting to capture this bridge as a backup option in crossing this river in case they got stalled in this gate here. So this is essentially the key point is that Russian troops are almost done capturing a couple of key strongholds villages, which specifically Sokil, Novoaleksandrivka, and then Novopokrovsk. They done, and then that will uh, mean that then there's sort of last line of defense. As I said, it was just going to be Luzovatske, Progress, Volche. And so they will be sort of storming the final line of defense in this whole sort of system that I described. Then also Russian troops are moving south of this pond and river system towards Karlivka. That's the next key objective here. Again, this is sort of along the same line of Lozovatske, Progress, Karlivka. If they bridge this, then it's definitely going to be much harder for Ukrainian troops to defend this whole territory, because then it's going to be much more sort of regular terrain with sparse villages, and there is no real defense lines prepared because of the corruption in Ukrainian army and the civilian administration. And so that's going to be very difficult to hold Russian troops at that point. So this is the most dangerous area of the entire front line at this moment. Then Russian troops are still, so if we take a look at south, Russian troops are still in process of capturing Krasnohorivka. They're not done. They pushing as well southwest of Marinka without terribly much progress in this area, actually. And then something similar happening west of Novomikhailivka. There is not really much of Russian progress there either. Now let's move to Zaporizhya front line. Things here somewhat similar. First, Russian troops are almost done capturing Staromayorske. They're in process of capturing Orozhaine, so they try to basically eliminate Ukrainian gains from the summer of 23. There is not terribly much at this point pressure around this Robotine. I would say that Russian troops, Russian command is probably bringing everything they can to that area that I just discussed. That's I don't even know how you call it, like area west of Avdiivka, I guess that's the best description. Um, and that's obviously focused for the Russian command at this moment. And now let's finish with the situation across along the Dnipro River. So as mentioned before, Russian troops eliminated this Ukrainian. Well, they didn't quite eliminate it. Ukrainian actually command pulled pulled troops from the bridgeheads because they need to remove and actually need to update. They needed this 36th Brigade to plug the hole near Kharkiv. So that's really what played out here. So situation more or less sort of stable as Dnipro River sort of separates both parties. Russian troops do try to capture some of these islands in the Dnipro Delta, and that's so far not really working well for them because it all leads to high losses without really any meaningful benefit. And given that the focus right now is not this area, apparently, they need all of the troops that they have up northwest of Avdiivka. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Bye bye.